Hello and welcome back. Today's lecture is going to be on the Jefferson administration. Thomas Jefferson, who's a Democratic Republican, has in the election of 1800 run against John Adams, the Federalist, and he won. To Adams' credit, he transferred power peacefully to his opposition party, which will set that precedent for all future presidents. So hopefully all future presidents, right? Jefferson, we got to talk about kind of his political philosophy. He's huge on liberty. He believes that the state governments are more connected to the people, and so the state government should have more power than the federal government. So he wants, a restricted federal government. Economically, he believes that all Americans should have the freedom of being a small farmer, right? Like he doesn't envision an industrial America like the Federalists kind of envision. He thinks that, if you truly want to be free, own your own farm, be self-sustaining. That gives you true freedom. Any extra, you can sell so you can, buy things that you need, but that's kind of his vision for America. He wants to reduce the size of the federal government. He wants to cut taxes. He wants to limit the size of the army, right? He thinks, the bigger the army, the more likely you are to want to use it. It's expensive. He doesn't think that the federal government should be spending that kind of money. And he wants to reduce the size of the federal bureaucracy. And so the bureaucracy are just workers, right? And so, the federal bureaucracy are federal government workers. He wants to reduce that because, a large bureaucracy is expensive, but it's also oppressive in his belief, right? So he thinks that the more government agencies that are out there, it's the more the governments that going to tell you what you can and can't do. So he wants to shrink the size of the bureaucracy. And he wants to let the Bank of the United States run out its charter. That's going to be controversial later. The Bank of the United States, he believes that it's, Eastern elites that have a lot of this money in the bank that are deciding who gets loans and who doesn't get loans. He doesn't want that kind of banking system. We talked in a previous lecture about banking and how important it is. And Jefferson knows that banking's important. He just wants small community banks where, the investors, the depositors, the people who put their money into the banks, can have a little bit more control over who and, where money's invested. But this big national bank, Jefferson believes, is being run by Eastern elites and the super wealthy, and that the federal government's money being put in there is then being manipulated by a few Eastern elites and foreigners, because foreigners are investing in the bank as well. So he's going to let that run out or planning to let that run out in 1811. That's going to be, national bank is going to be controversial. We'll talk about that again during the Jackson administration. He's going to be a very popular president. We will, spoiler alert here, he will win re-election. He will serve 2 terms. He will step down after his second term, because if Washington stepped down after 2 terms, Jefferson feels the need to do that as well. Now, one of the first things that is going to happen during the Jefferson administration is going to be the death of Alexander Hamilton. Jefferson has really 2 big political rivals. Alexander Hamilton is, kind of the forerunner for the next Federalist president, right? He is, he's a big federal government guy. He's pro, factory and manufacturing. He wants a large national government, so he's the opposite of Jefferson. And so that is one of Jefferson's biggest rivals from the opposite party. But within his own party, he's going to have Aaron Burr, who is his vice president, who's his biggest threat from within his party. And so, Burr is a rival. And by all accounts, Burr's this he talks a lot of trash. He's had some shady business dealings. I mean, the guy is kind of shady. Well, what's going to end up happening is that Hamilton, who is, not in the government right now, he's an attorney in New York, but he's essentially the leader of the Federalist Party, is going to say some very critical things about Aaron Burr, and I think those things, for the most part, are fairly accurate. And he's doing it in public, and as he does that in public, Aaron Burr feels offended by that, and so he will challenge Hamilton to a duel for attacking his character, and Alexander Hamilton will, accept that duel. And so, the two go out. They pace off. They turn. They fire. There's different accounts of how this happened. Some people say that Aaron Burr shot, or not Aaron Burr, Alexander Hamilton shot in the air, missing on purpose to prove his bravery. Where Aaron Burr, took his time, aimed, and fired. Either way, what ends up happening is, I don't know if that's true. What ends up happening is Hamilton gets shot, and he will die. Aaron Burr then, Alexander Hamilton is, one of our founding fathers. He wrote the majority of the Federalist Papers. I mean, this guy is super popular. And even if you don't like his politics, even if you're not a Federalist, I mean, you owe your liberty in part to this guy. And so he's very, very popular. And when he's killed, Aaron Burr, is shunned. He heads out west. He's implicated in like some conspiracy theories out there. But essentially, what ends up happening is the two duel. Hamilton dies, and now Jefferson's greatest rivals are both essentially out of the picture. Hamilton was kind of the only guy that could have challenged Jefferson in the 1804 election. So he's dead. And his biggest rival from within his own political party, Aaron Burr, he's being shunned and is essentially, his life in politics is over. He's going to try an attempt to, break up the West and the Ohio Territory and make it a new country of his own, which it'll fail miserably. But essentially, for all practical purposes, Aaron Burr's career will be over. So the next big thing that Jefferson has to deal with is going to be super important, and it has to do with the judiciary, right? And so it has to do with judges. So what essentially ends up happening is when Adams is getting ready to leave office, he realizes that the Federalists are really losing complete power. Adams is a Federalist. He's the president, so the Federalists control the executive branch, but also the Federalists controlled Congress. But with this election, the Federalists lost Congress. And so the Democratic Republicans are taking over. Jefferson's Republicans are just taking over. And, when this happens, Adams is panicking. He's like, oh my God, they're going to undo everything I did. And so one of the things that the president has power to do is appoint judges. And so at the last minute, Adams just starts appointing a ton of Federalist judges. And so all the way up until the time he's leaving office, he's like, okay, you're going to be a judge, and you're going to be a judge, and you're going to be a judge. And he's having his Secretary of State, James Madison, hand out all this paperwork to make these people judges. Now, the deal is that paperwork has to be delivered to them legally before he leaves office. And so he's running around trying to pack all these judges to preserve Federalist power, and these judges that are getting these last minute appointments are known as midnight judges because they're getting some of them are getting their appointment at midnight before Jefferson takes over, but not all of these judges actually get their paperwork before Adams has to leave office. And one of those guys is going to be a guy by the name of William Marbury. William Marbury knew he was supposed to get this appointment, but it was never delivered during the Adams administration. So Marbury wants to be a judge. This is like one of the best jobs you can have in the entire country, and gives you power, prestige, money. I mean, it's a good gig to have. He clearly wants it. He goes to the Jefferson administration and says, you need to deliver that paperwork. And Jefferson's Secretary of State, James Madison, says, no, like we're under no obligation to do this. Now, Congress had passed a law previously saying that Congress can issue what is referred to as a writ of mandibus. This writ of mandibus is essentially an order to the president to execute a law, right? So we have separation of powers, and Congress gets to write the laws, but the executive branch executes them. And so sometimes Congress writes a law and the executive branch, the president, just doesn't enforce that law. And we do that so we don't live in a tyrannical environment where one part of the government can create a tyrannical government. So we don't want that to happen. So we have these checks and balances. But when Congress says, when they pass this law that says they can issue a writ of mandibus, they essentially are telling the president, you don't get to pick and choose which laws you enforce and which laws you don't enforce. And so William Marbury says, issue the writ of mandibus and make him give me this paperwork that I should legally have. And technically, he should have been delivered that paperwork. And so William Marbury sues, and he's telling the court to tell the president that he has to deliver this paperwork. Well, Chief Justice John Marshall, in what is probably the most genius move ever made by a judge, will rule against Marbury. And he will say, essentially, sorry, we can't make the president enforce the law. Now, I say it's genius because he does a couple of things here. Which will essentially establish the idea that the judicial branch is a co-equal branch to Congress and the executive branch. And this ruling, by the way that he logics it, the way that he said, the reason for the ruling is going to give the Supreme Court and the judicial branch the power to declare laws unconstitutional. Now, today we take that for granted, that the court can declare laws unconstitutional. I challenge you to get out your copy of the Constitution and find in the Constitution, Article 3, that's where the judicial branch is. I challenge you to find anywhere in there that says the court can declare laws unconstitutional. All right, I'll give you a minute. I'm just kidding. I'm not going to give you a minute because it's not in there. I know it's not in there. And so, but here's how we come to accept it. What John Marshall says is, he says, you know what? Legally, Marbury should get his paperwork to become a judge, but I don't have the power to tell the executive branch how to execute the law. The Constitution very clearly says that the president gets to execute laws, the judicial branch interprets laws, and the legislative branch, Congress, writes the laws. And by the way, that writ of mandibus, that law that Congress passed that said that the president must execute laws, that, by the way, is unconstitutional. Congress doesn't have that power. Right? He just said Congress passed a law that the Constitution doesn't say they have the power to pass. Therefore, that's unconstitutional. And I'm telling the government and all the citizens that the judicial branch has the power to do that. And so even though there's nowhere in the Constitution that says they have to do that, and the other two branches accept it and just go along with it. And so the idea, that concept of declaring a law unconstitutional is the concept of judicial review. And then subsequently, we've all just accepted that that is, yes, the way that it should be, even though it's not actually in the Constitution. So Constitution doesn't allow the Supreme Court or Congress to force the executive to issue writs of mandamus, to issue an order that says the executive branch must enforce the law. And ultimately, right, that creates judicial review, or the ability of the court system to declare a law or act unconstitutional. That's why I say this is the single greatest judicial ruling ever, because it allows for all those other great court cases and some terrible ones. Dred Scott was terrible, but the Brown versus Board of Education was a great one. So, those things would not have been possible. Loving versus Virginia, those Supreme Court rulings would not have been possible if John Marshall wouldn't have ruled in the way that he did and given the Supreme Court the power that the Supreme Court has. So Jefferson is a strict constructionist. We've talked about this several times. He believes in limited federal power, that if the Constitution doesn't specifically give the president the power, the president doesn't have that power. There will be one big discrepancy in this, and that is the West. Right? He is not going to be consistent with his small government philosophy, because he's going to get an opportunity that he just can't pass up, and he's going to do something that the Constitution doesn't say he has the right to do, and that's buy a bunch of land from a foreign power. The Constitution doesn't say that the president can buy more land for this country, right? But when an opportunity arises, Jefferson, who wants the entire country to be small farmers, and to be able to do that, you have to have lots of land, is going to assume a power that the Constitution doesn't actually give him. Right? So here's what happened. The French own the port city of New Orleans and all of what we would call today the Louisiana Territory, which is like the Midwest. Now, New Orleans is critically important to the United States. Most of the farming that we do out west, right, we got to use the Mississippi River to transport those goods down to the port of New Orleans, right, put them on ocean-bearing ships to be able to ship them out to the rest of the world, or even back up to, New York and Boston in the Northeast. And so if you control New Orleans, which is at the base of the Mississippi River, you can stop all those ships and charge a fee for moving through the port of New Orleans. And that's what the French are doing. That's making it very expensive for Americans to ship goods, even to their own cities around the country. And so we want to own New Orleans, but the French own it. So Jefferson is going to want to purchase New Orleans to make it more profitable for American farmers to ship goods down the Mississippi. And so, these fees are just outrageous, and we want the city. So Jefferson will send James Monroe to France to negotiate to buy just the city of New Orleans for $10 million. Now, this is important because where in the Constitution does it say that the president has this ability to do this? It doesn't. So this is Jefferson acting like a federalist, right? One of those people that believe in a strong national government. So, it points out some of, his philosophical inconsistencies here. But something else is going to happen. At this point, Napoleon is in charge of France, and he's fighting a massive war against all of Europe, right? And wars are expensive. And so he needs money. He needs it bad. He just lost an uprising in Haiti. So the French controlled Haiti, and they were abusing the population there, and the population rose up and kicked the French out. And so the French are like, man, it's really expensive to keep troops in the Americas, right? And in the Caribbean. And so the French are pulling out of Haiti. And, Napoleon says, I don't want to keep spending money in that area of the world when I'm fighting this war in Europe, right? It would behoove me, it would benefit me if I took all my troops out of the Americas, including the Louisiana Territory and New Orleans, and bring them back to Europe so they can fight the European powers. And it would be nice to get a little extra money to help fight in this war. So Napoleon is ready to sell, but he's not just ready to sell New Orleans. he's ready to sell all of his possessions in America. So, this is going to lead to a really exciting opportunity for James Monroe, who's going to have to make a decision, right? He can't just he's going to go there and he's going to be like, hey, you look, Napoleon, dude, can I buy New Orleans for $10 million? And Napoleon's going to be like, hey, I got a better idea. I'll sell you all of the Louisiana territory, which is essentially the Midwest today. I'll sell you all of that territory for $15 million. And Monroe's like, whoa, I don't know if the president is going to be okay with that. He can't call him up. We don't have cell phones. He can't shoot a little email, right? There's no internet. He's just got to make a decision. He's going to be like, sounds too good to pass up. So I'm going to go ahead and say yes. And we're going to end up purchasing all of that territory for that territory right there, right? That's all that green that's outlined in purple. Instead of just that little bitty city of New Orleans, which is just at the bottom, just a little tiny. We're going to buy all of that land right there for $15 million, right? I mean, this is going to be a massive expansion of the United States. And it's going to be essentially, we're buying the breadbasket of the world, right? I mean, America's a net exporter of food. And a lot of that food is going to come from this territory right here. And so, this is vitally important for our economic, our economic situation. It's vitally important for, security purposes. That allows us to be food self-sufficient. I mean, this is a huge, huge deal. So Napoleon offers all the land to America. Monroe agrees and just hopes that Jefferson and Congress are going to be down, and they are. It is ultimately too good of a deal to pass up. And so Jefferson agrees to buy it. And so, he doesn't think he has the authority to do it. He is a Republican, a Democratic Republican, and does not like debt. And so he's got all these things that make him say, oh, maybe I shouldn't do it, but it's just too good of a deal to pass up. Takes it. Now, the reality is we just bought all this land, but nobody really knows what we bought, right? It's some markings on a map, but very few people have explored that whole territory. And so the next thing that has to happen is Jefferson has to figure out, well, what is it that I just bought? What resources are out there? Is there good farmland? Is there materials? Is there a passage, a Northwest Passage, a river route that connects the Atlantic Ocean with the Pacific Ocean? Who knows? And so he's going to send Lewis and Clark to explore and find out what is it that we bought, and most importantly, is there a river route that will connect the Atlantic Ocean and the Pacific Ocean? Spoiler alert, there's not, but we don't know that yet. So we got to explore the territory. We find out what we bought. Jefferson is going to choose his secretary, Meriwether Lewis, and Lewis will choose William Clark as his partner. They're going to put together an expedition with a whole bunch of different people. It's going to be very dangerous trip they're going to take. They're going to start out from the great city of St. Louis. There's the arch right there. That arch is the gateway to the west. They call the arch the gateway to the west because this is technically where Lewis and Clark are starting their journey. And so the St. Louis is going to be essentially the starting point for this journey. That's why it gets called the gateway to the west. And they're going to head out and try and make their way across the country. So they're trying to find the water route to the Pacific. And, like I said, it's incredibly dangerous. They can't do it on their own. They are going to hire a Shoshone woman by the name of Sacagawea as an interpreter and a guide. I'm going to tell you right now, there's no way that they could have gotten through without Sacagawea. She's going to, show them not only kind of what flora and fauna that they can eat along the way. She's going to be able to be an interpreter to these other tribes. She actually is going to, by the time they get out to the Oregon Territory, she's going to have a family among the Nez Perce who are going to be absolutely critical in helping Lewis and Clark survive this journey, which is a shame because the route that Lewis and Clark takes is going to bring settlers into the Nez Perce territory that will ultimately lead to the destruction of the Nez Perce, who are some of the most peaceful Native Americans in the entire country. And so Sacagawea does that. And she's like this young kid. I think she's 14 and she's pregnant when they start the journey. She has her baby on the journey and is going to take her newborn baby through all these hardships that that kill grown men. It's absolutely amazing what this young lady does, and there's no way Lewis and Clark could have done it without her. So big props to Sacagawea. All right. The whole trip's going to last about 2 years and 4 months. They are going to be instrumental in mapping out the West, which is going to allow for later settlement, and list the national resources that are available out there, and like I said, set the course for future settlement. So the Louisiana Purchase is probably the single most important thing that the Jefferson administration does, but he's also going to have to deal with some foreign policy issues, and that's going to be the Chesapeake incident. And so the Chesapeake incident, the Jay's Treaty is expired. So both the British and the French are attacking each other and American ships. The British are back to impressing, not like impressing like I'm going to impress you, but impressment. So which is essentially kidnapping and forcing sailors into serving on your ships. The British are kidnapping American sailors and forcing them to serve on British ships, and so that's happening again. One major incident is going to happen with the American ship, the Chesapeake. So the British ship, the Leopard, there are a couple of sailors that when they get into on the Leopard, the British ship is the Leopard, and there are some British sailors that once the Leopard gets close to American territory, a handful of sailors will jump off the Leopard at night, swim to shore to America because they're tired of serving in the British Navy. They want to start over in America. There's all kinds of free land out there, and they think that's what they want to do. Well, one of those sailors goes to a local pub and is getting drunk and is bragging about how he escaped the Leopard. Well, while he's at this pub drinking beer and getting drunk and bragging, there are actually British soldiers from the Leopard in the pub. They hear about it, and they hear that British soldier just got a job on the USS Chesapeake. So those British soldiers go back to the Leopard, tell their commanding officer that there are British deserters on the Chesapeake, and there are. So the Leopard is going to just kind of hang out in the harbor until the Chesapeake leaves the harbor, and the Leopard is essentially going to say, to the Chesapeake, pull over. We think there are British soldiers on your ship. There are. But does that give them the right to pull over an American ship? Well, and the answer to that is no. And so the Chesapeake is going to say, no, I'm not going to pull over. The Leopard will open fire. There will be 21 casualties. And essentially the Leopard, the British will board the ship. They're going to take their soldiers back, their sailors back. As a matter of fact, the guy, the British sailor that did desert, he's going to end up being hung. But this is a national embarrassment, and it makes us look weak, and it looks like we're being bullied again. And remember, Jefferson, small government guy, cut the size of the army, and so Jefferson wants to respond to this, but he doesn't want to respond with military force. And so what he does is he passes an embargo, which is a restriction of trade. And so he says, "Look, the British and the French are taking our soldiers. we're going to stop trading with the British and the French to try and hurt their economy. Well, if America did that today, it would be devastating to the British and the French economy because our economy is so much larger than the British and the French economy. But in the 1800s, we need the British and the French more than they need us. The British and the French economies are larger than our economies. So, this embargo that is meant to hurt the British and the French, guess who it hurts more? Us. So, the embargo of 1807, not very effective. It really ends up hurting the American economy more than it hurts the British and the French economy. And, we still have the problem of, British and French impressment. And so this is really going to kind of derail Jefferson's second term. So that concludes today's lecture on the Jefferson administration. Thank you very much for your time. I will see you again shortly.